everyone. Welcome to In Limbo Conversations. Today we have with us Kevin McCain. He's an associate professor of philosophy at the University of Alabama at Birmingham and is also the co-editor of the Rochlade Studies in Epistemology series. His central areas of research are issues in contemporary epistemology and philosophy of science. He also concentrates on explanatory reasoning and its role in responding to skeptical challenges, as well as generating scientific and everyday knowledge. Thank you for joining us, Kevin.
Thank you for having me.
I thought we could start by talking about uncertainty and its relation to the complexity in our world, and in the larger sense, how such uncertainty gets concealed in media coverage of issues. So as a background for our audience, this year Kostas Kamporikis and Kevin McCain authored a book. It is titled Uncertainty, How It Makes Science Advance. We have linked it in the description of this video. In this book, they talk about the role of uncertainty in science, also about the kinds of uncertainty which are inherent in certain fields of research, like human evolution, vaccination, and forensic science. They focus on how uncertainty could drive understanding in scientific endeavors. So the first thing I wanted to ask you, Kevin, was the complexity of our world and its relation to uncertainty. So if we could pick out like a slice from everything that's happening in the current pandemic situation, say maybe the origin of coronavirus or the Wuhan outbreak and the spread across the world, the entire picture is just very, very complex. So could you tell us, using this instance or any other, how complexity of our world is inherently fertile and creates conditions for uncertainty, perhaps how uncertainty is inevitable?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question. So I think one of the ways that can be helpful first is to distinguish between, as we do in the book, between two broad kinds of uncertainty. So the first sort is psychological uncertainty. And this just has to do with how confident we are about something that we believe or think is true, right? So we might be completely psychologically certain, right? We have absolutely no doubts. But there's another sort of uncertainty that has to do with our evidence. This is what we call epistemic uncertainty, right? And this has to do with how strongly our evidence supports believing something. And one of the claims we make in the book is that rationality is really matching these levels of uncertainty. So in another way of putting it is, we should only be as psychologically confident of something to the degree that it matches the evidence, the strength of our evidence. So one claim that we make is pretty much everything is to some degree epistemically uncertain, right? We almost have and possibly never have evidence that's so strong that it makes the truth of whatever we believe absolutely certain, when there's no possibility of error. So to give a simple example of that, right now, I know where my car is parked, but I'm not epistemically certain of that, right? There's still a slight chance. The evidence that I have is I remember where I parked it. Typically, you know, when I park it in that spot, it's safe and so on. But there's a chance that it's been towed or something else, someone maybe stole it. So I'm not epistemically certain. And so as you mentioned, I come from a largely an epistemology background. And so my initial research back when I was in graduate school, which has been several years now, which is kind of a surprise, but or surprise to me, was dealing with skepticism. And I think one of the lessons of skepticism is not that we lack knowledge or reasonable belief about the world around us, but one of the key lessons is we don't have epistemic certainty. And so I think that what happens a lot of times is we want certainty. We want the sort of psychological certainty. And sometimes we approach things with that, but we don't have the epistemic certainty. And so all that's kind of just to lay some groundwork to your initial question. The more complex things are, in simplest terms, the more ways for us to go wrong, right? So the lower the amount of epistemic certainty. So when we're talking about something like the coronavirus and these various outbreaks, and there's so much information and there's so many little details, any one of these things can make a difference to say how it spread when we're still learning ways about how it might be most commonly spread, what's the best safety measures and so on. There's always going to be some uncertainty there because our evidence, even when we've really locked it down. So for instance, there's very good evidence wearing masks and keeping a certain distance can help fight the spread. It's not certain that it does so, right? But it's also, not certain that I'm talking to you right now. But it'd be crazy to think that I'm not talking to you. Similarly, with things that are this complex, we never have certainty, but we do have, say, good evidence, right? And the evidence is going to be a little more theoretical. It's going to be a little more open to change on what all evidence we have, because there's so much complexity. There's so much to understand.
Okay.
I hope that kind of answers a little.
Yeah, it does. So that does take me to how we generally treat this uncertainty, right? So in the book too, you had taken the case study to talk about roots and possible impact of uncertainty in science. So I guess vaccinations are a great example for the current situation. There is buzz about Oxford vaccination being in phase 3 trials, and that there would definitely be a viable vaccine by 2021. So could you tell us two things? First is this, like you just said, the mirage of psychological certainty, which sort of glosses over the underlying uncertainty. So there are these popular messages about vaccination at large, and what a little bit about that. And second, about why do you feel there is such a reaction to uncertainty, if that is something that you're interested in sharing with us? Yeah.
Oh, good. Yeah. So I think both of those are great questions. I'll start with the second question first, and then go to the first after that. So I think we have this sort of reaction about uncertainty because psychological uncertainty makes us uncomfortable, right? So think about why we want to know and be able to predict things about the future, because the more certain we can be that something's going to happen, the better we can prepare for it. The more comfortable we are, the less we have to be afraid of the unknown. So I think we just naturally have this aversion to being uncertain. The problem is we have such an aversion a lot of times to psychological uncertainty that we'll ignore epistemic uncertainties. And I think this is to your first question. I think we see some of that when we make claims like, oh, there will definitely be a vaccine by this time. That seems like too strong of a commitment there, right? So if you look, experts that are being more careful are saying, well, we're hopeful there'll be a vaccine, or we've got reason to think there will be, or we're working as hard as we can, and there's decent odds of this happening. But you'll see others, particularly in political realms, possibly because of the uncertainty, but possibly for other reasons, saying, oh, we're definitely going to have a vaccine by this time, because that's more reassuring to people, right? So when you hear that, you go, oh, I can plan on my life getting back to normal by this time, so everything's okay. Whereas if you tell people, we have good evidence, maybe we can even quantify it and say, I don't know, there's a 85% chance that we'll have a vaccine by this time. People find that way less comforting. And sometimes it's problematic too, because people will, in those cases, sometimes doubt whether it's legitimate science. So one of the things we talk about in the book is people in some areas of science have this, the general public has this view that if it's science, then it's absolutely certain. So if when they hear about, as scientists widely know and accept, and philosophers know, that there's always a chance of error, right? So there's always, in any sort of scientific study you read, they'll say, we've got really good reason to think that, that this is the answer, or so on. But they always mention there's a slight probability that this is due to, say, random chance or some noise in the way we've gotten our data. But the general public doesn't typically like that or respond to that. So they typically will often think, if you say, well, scientists think there's this % chance that, say, a vaccine will come, a lot of times the general public will say, well, that means they don't know what they're talking about. If they can't tell me there's going to be a vaccine by this time, then they just should keep quiet, because they don't know. And I think that's because we have a confusion about epistemic certainty and what's really required to know something.
Right. So that's more like an urge for black and white than gray, I guess, like we generally have.
Exactly. That's a great way to put it. Yeah, we want the black and white answer. We're uncomfortable in the gray, which unfortunately we're always in the gray.
Right. So that connects to what I just wanted to ask you next, which is this relates to the theory that you proposed in your 2014 book, Evidentialism and Epistemic Justification.
Hmm.
As a background, in
Yeah.
2014, Kevin authored this book, which tackles three broad metapistemic issues about evidentialism. First, there is the significant question of what evidence is. What sort of thing counts as evidence? Second, there are questions about how broad or narrow one's criterion for evidence should be. Can you include even your childhood memories as evidence, or only what you are thinking right now? And finally, there is also the question of what it means to believe based on one's evidence. So in this book, Kevin has proposed explanationist evidentialism. You can check out the link in the description to reach the book. I wanted to look at one very specific aspect of this, Kevin, today. Usually in traditional coherentism, only beliefs count as evidence. But in your account, you allow mental states other than beliefs, like experiences, to be evidence too. And connecting this to what it means to believe, to be based on evidence, right? So could you tell us a bit about experiences as evidence, and maybe some instance you have seen over the months where people have used their experience to justify a false or a true belief?
Oh, good. Yeah, very good. Yeah, so in general, I think experiences are often great evidence when taken to the appropriate level, right? So, for instance, why do I believe that I'm talking to you rather than, say, in a room by myself, which I am, but talking to no one, right? No one on the other end of the computer screen. Well, part of my reason is various beliefs, right, about how computers work and so on. But another part is I have an experience of seeing you on the screen. I have an experience of hearing you, right? I have lots of these experiences, or even think even more basic one that requires less. So imagine I look out the window and I have an experience as of seeing a tree. That gives me some evidence for thinking there's a tree out there. Right? This seems to be really good evidence. Now, whether it's evidence all on its own or sufficiently good evidence to believe there's a tree on its own, maybe not. You know, I might have to have background beliefs about, say, what trees look like or so on. Though that's all possible. But it does seem pretty clear that the experience is evidence. And we can, you know, continue to go even more basic. So imagine that you're currently, hopefully this is not true, but imagine that you're currently experiencing a pretty intense pain. That experience itself is good reason for you to believe that you're in pain, right? And so I think experiences can definitely be evidence, and they're some of our strongest evidence. I'm finishing up a manuscript with a philosopher at the University of Aberdeen, Luca Moretti, and he and I are kind of expanding on the sort of explanationist picture that I've presented in previous work. We're expanding that to account for a view that gives a really strong role to our appearances. So experiences of a certain kind, visual appearances, auditory appearances, and so on. And so I really think that at base level, a lot of our evidence, perhaps all of it, grounds out an experience of some sort. Now, that being said, sometimes we kind of use the evidence of experience in the wrong way. And so here's what I mean. So here's a common mistake that people have. We often take anecdotal evidence. So for instance, things that we've experienced personally or someone we know has experienced, and we grant them way more strength than we do other evidence, like well-documented scientific facts. So here's an easy example of that. I know many people, and you may as well, that are terrified of flying in an airplane, right? And they're convinced that it's just so unsafe. Right. Despite, you can give them all the evidence and say, look, actually, it's one of the safest modes of travel. You can tell them, like here in the US, you can say thousands and thousands of people die every year in car accidents, which they're not afraid of traveling in, and very few die in plane crashes. But the anecdotal evidence, when they've seen on television, like, you know, a plane has went down and people have died, it really stands out more to their mind, and they give it more weight than they should. So I think in that sort of case, they do have evidence based on their experience. It's just that they weight it too strongly, right? They let it outweigh. And I think, again, you know, my experience is largely my local area in the US. I think we've seen a lot of that sort of thing happen in the United States with respect to the COVID-19 problem, right? So we've seen people say, well, I know someone they had this, they were tested positive for COVID, and they were fine. So, right, I don't need to worry about this. And so, despite lots of warnings, I mean, that is some evidence that maybe they would be okay if they caught it, or other people would be too. But they weight that too heavily because it's, well, in my own experience, I know someone who's had it, they were fine, it's not a big deal. And so they disregard all of the other evidence because their personal experience they weight too strongly. So I think it's one of these interesting things where our experience of that sort, and even our experience of what the other and the scientific evidence is what we have to go on. But we sometimes weight certain experiences more than we should. We give them more evidential control of what we believe than what we should.
Yeah, so I was thinking, like, so when you said experiences as evidence, right? So with beliefs, there is a certain way in which we can verify, because there is a certain way in which we can have a third person and verify it with certain reports. And with one's own evidence, like experience, that part becomes a bit difficult. So there could be, so how do you generally propose checking one's evidence? So if I'm really scared that I'm going to get the coronavirus, just even though I have not had contact with anyone, but maybe I just got some grocery and then so how does one sort of justify one's, if I can use that experience to say that, no, I could have, because I'm just feeling a little bit of headache, or I'm having a little bit. Right. So how do you generally verify one's experience? So it's corroboration, or how would you sort of?
Yeah, exactly. I think it'd be corroboration with your other experiences, but also with your beliefs, right? So the way I look at it is your experiences are evidence, but so are your beliefs, if they're, a reasonable belief. It's a tricky question of whether, if you have some irrational belief, that if that counts as evidence or not. So I tend to think that those aren't genuine evidence. But say that you have this experience and you want to know, okay, do I have this? I'm having a headache, and you're maybe just a worrying person, and you go, well, so maybe I've got it. Even the way to judge that, and the way to get the sort of right, rational and justified response, is to look at not just that bit of evidence, but your overall evidence. So it's always a matter of all the evidence that I have. So I have a headache, and we go, well, maybe that's a symptom. But then we take into account my other evidence, which, as you mentioned, is, okay, I haven't been around anyone at all. So I didn't catch it from anyone else. I haven't engaged in, I have no other symptoms. Maybe I often am prone to headaches at a certain time of the day anyway, so you have all this sort of evidence. And the key is always, we have to look at your overall set of evidence, because you might have, and we often do, you might have some evidence that supports one thing, but a lot of other evidence that doesn't. And so when we put it all together, we have to look and see, what does that total evidence support? Does it support thinking that I have an infection? Does it support even thinking that it's likely, right? And then we have to make decisions, of course, based on that. So if it ends up where I'm like, well, the odds that I have it are pretty low, but I'm at a high risk. So maybe I work in the health profession and I might get someone sick. Then even though the odds are low and maybe I shouldn't believe I have it, it might be that the probability is high enough that I should get tested anyway because of the risk. Whereas on the other hand, if the odds are really low, and I'm not at risk for, infecting anyone else, then maybe I should wait and see. And so it really all depends. We have to always think about the total evidence that we have.
Okay. So this total evidence would include not only one's experiences, but also the beliefs. So that would be, okay.
Exactly.
Right.
Yes.
So it also relates to the article you wrote on the University of Alabama Reporter about how we can be responsible news consumers. So I think it was Sharon Dunwoody. She had reviewed your book, and she said this, that accepting the ubiquity of uncertainty in science is a start, but learning how to not let uncertainty get in the way of understanding is the next critical step. So you had looked at the relation between scientific knowledge and psychological certainty and rationality in this article. And we have also talked about psychological certainty and uncertainty inherent in scientific knowledge here in our conversation right now. So I wanted to ask you, there are some instances that you had mentioned in your article. So there were the spring bakers on one hand who had doubted the seriousness of the situation. And then we have on the other hand, those who drank bleach. And for both of those group of subjects, their decision would have felt informed and rational. So just like we talked. And given this, Where and how do we draw the line? Could you give us a short checklist kind of thing where, if possible, to help us make rational decisions amidst such uncertainties?
Good. That's a great question. And yeah, I mean, it's unfortunate that we see the errors kind of on both extremes. I think in general, none of this is going to seem too surprising. I think the way to best manage our uncertainty is, of course, first to admit it, that we have it, learn about it, and learn how to deal with it, rather than opting for a black and white answer because it makes us feel better, right? So first admit the uncertainty, but then do the sorts of things that are good for inquiry in general. So if I've got some evidence, so a lot of people will say, they saw something on social media, for instance, and say, well, so this is the right answer on this. Verify your sources, check. So if you see something on social media, that doesn't necessarily mean it's wrong, but it definitely doesn't mean it's true either. So verify the sources, consult multiple sources, right? Especially if you can get independent sources, right? So if you can say, okay, this news outlet is saying this about the virus. What does this other independent source say? What does this other one say? So look for reliable sources, consult them, see what they're saying, check and see what the experts are saying, right? So the doctors are saying this, the epidemiologists are saying this. Look at that and give that sort of information the appropriate weight. So the thing we need to do is check our sources, look at a variety of sources, see which ones are the most reliable, which ones we have the most reason to trust. Look at them, see what they're saying, and give them the appropriate weight. So the fact that someone's friend on social media who's not an expert says something, maybe that counts as a little bit of evidence, but it's nowhere near as much evidence as, say, when the CDC gives some advice on this, right? So that's the sort of things we need to do.
Okay, so those are the 3 points. So we're just going to be mentioning that. So to verify one's sources, to use multiple reliable sources, and to check what the experts are saying, including the organizations, right? Okay, so thank you for sharing these points with us. That covers the things that I wanted to talk to you about. And in the end, I thought I would quote a tiny thing from your book. So you had written this in the dedication of your book, Uncertainty, How It Makes Science Advance. So here are 12 hopeful words. May you come to understand uncertainty and have no fear of it. Thank you, Kevin, for joining me today. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.